I'm sure we've all had those moments where we struggle to process our thoughts and emotions, where we become a blurb of confusion, distress, and fear, to the point we just don't feel normal. It's this mental anomaly, this struggle to comfortably self-regulate one's own emotions without self-persecution, that makes the 2016 psychological thriller I Am Not a Serial Killer, based on the book by Dan Wells, fairly relatable. Now, firstly, let me clarify before anyone gets any ideas, I am not associating this description with being specifically similar to the subject matter of I Am Not a Serial Killer, but more so I'm focusing on the film's broad sentiment of what it's like being so trapped in your own head that you just never feel like you can truly be yourself. I Am Not a Serial Killer tells the story of a 16-year-old teenager called John Cleaver, who after being diagnosed with sociopathy and working with a therapist to control his apparent homicidal intrusive thoughts, tries to find some essence of meaning in his life when he discovers a serial killer is on the loose in his small Midwestern town of Clayton County. I'm probably going to say this a lot, but it's a fittingly abnormal take on the unofficial subgenre of overzealous sleuthing teenager trying to expose a killer, in that John doesn't exactly have that archetypical naive, albeit heroic heart of gold. Hell, John even questions if he even has a heart to begin with. As a sociopath, the general premise of John's character is that he lacks empathy, exhibits antisocial tendencies, and shows nothing but apathy towards others and his own existence. However, that's not to say he isn't an emotive character. While I'm not qualified to say I Am Not a Serial Killer is an authentic portrayal of a sociopath, it sure as hell approaches it with the respect, nuance, and understanding of how social disorders can affect one's ability to find and maintain meaningful relationships in a world that can be pretty cold to people who are different or perceived as an outsider, as director Billy O'Brien told Film in Revolt. I think that's why I find it a genuinely relatable film for the most part. Ultimately, it's a story inherently rooted in depression, loneliness, and fear of the self. A kid who feels alienated and invisible, and burdened by this perceived negative part of him that will forever control how he sees the world. Like The Clove Hitch Killer, which I covered recently, I Am Not a Serial Killer is a slow, melancholic character drama that de-emphasizes the killer in favor of tonal and atmospheric qualities that for some might leave a lot to be desired. However, brace yourself because, as you'll see very shortly, the film quickly introduces a rather jarring horror element that will leave many feeling polarized, but for others compelled to see where this all goes. Now, just before we go any further, this video is sponsored by Vezi. February is a time of love, not just for your partner, spouse, or even yourself. It's also a time to love your feet and give them the same snuggly warmth, comfort, confidence, and style with the power of Vezi. Even as the weather remains dire and dreary, hoping for better days to come, say yes to the elements by taking your Valentine Vezis out for a self-care walk to breathe in some rejuvenating fresh air. My fiance and I like to match with our weekend Chelsea when out with our doggo Cheddar because their pool tabs make for easy on-off usage immediately by the door, and their breathable knit is perfect for all year-round temperatures. I specifically want to highlight that with how slippy our garden is these days with the constant rain, I cannot begin to tell you how often their high-traction soles have saved me from falling on my arse. With puddles and mud becoming a thing of the past thanks to Vezi's Dymatex 100% waterproof technology with easy, clean, versatile design, no longer is it a hassle to just get up and go for any adventure or any occasion with the people and pets I love. With a variety of styles to suit your aesthetic, make every moment this February unforgettable with Vezi. Visit vezi.com/ryanhollinger to get your comfy companion and receive an automatic 15% off your first order at checkout. And when you do, let me know which Vezis you get. Shot on 16mm with mostly natural lighting to give the film an old grainy VHS feel, as O'Brien describes it, I Am Not a Serial Killer takes place entirely through the eyes of John, whose life is basically consumed by the macabre, working as a mortuary's assistant for his mother April's funeral home, and having a distinct fascination in serial killers. Tensions first arise when the school principal shows concern for John's abnormally morbid essays on killers like Dennis Rader and Jeffrey Dahmer, armor, suggesting that John's unhealthy obsession with the subject matter could be cause for alarm. However, what's interesting about this in today's age of sensational true crime obsession, John's interest seems ironically pretty normal and healthy to me, yet it does call attention to the stigma attached to morbid curiosities that have inherently negative connotations, especially with his sociopath label already being a red flag around town. Hell, speaking for myself, I know people who think my fixation on horror media is a red flag of sorts, but just because it's not the sunshine and rainbows perception of normal doesn't mean it automatically correlates with any distressing behavior. That said, John's infatuation with cadavers sent to his mother's mortuary and his regular attendance at crime scenes where undetermined killings have occurred only go to reinforce a self-fulfilling prophecy where he's been labelled by so many classmates and townsfolk as, well, a bit of a freak. The thing about John is that he coldly accepts his label and opens up to his therapist Grant about his constant fear of living on the tipping point of committing homicide. He doesn't want to kill, but his understanding is that some primordial dark side of him will one day take control. John expresses his need to maintain rules that allow him to be perceived as normal, such as befriending a classmate called Max, who John sees as nothing more than a prop to make him feel human. There's a strong subversive quality to the tropes usually associated with other coming-of-age films. For example, there's a girl who serves as a love interest for John, but he coldly keeps himself away out of fear that a relationship with his tendencies could lead down a dark path. The thing is though, it shows that he does care about people. He expresses no fear of anything around him other than what's inside of him, thus giving the impression that he's trying to bury the true monster within, never mind the actual serial killer monster we've yet to establish. It's the feeling of a self-fulfilling prophecy that makes John a uniquely interesting character. It's not so much him being a sociopath than it is how fiercely self-aware he is of his own condition and what it could pertain to given his encyclopedic knowledge of serial killers. Much of the tension rests on the edge of that tipping point, where throughout we're constantly questioning if John truly is capable of murder, or if he's actually far more in control of himself than he believes. In fact, his therapist Grant seems pretty relaxed about things. He still helps John stay on top of his thoughts, but he expresses positivity about John being tremendously open about wanting to work on himself. Anyway, where the film's serial killer emerges is when continuous reports of animal-like killings lead John to follow a suspicious man who one day mysteriously arrives in town. He sees the man befriend John's elderly neighbour Bill Crowley, who innocently agrees to take the stranger ice fishing. However, when secluded at the frozen lake, John's suspicions are confirmed when the stranger pulls out a knife when Bill's back is turned, only to be killed by Bill, who pierces the man with a supernaturally thorny arm and then harvests his lungs to replace his own. Didn't see that coming, did you? The conceit here is that the serial killer we're dealing with is an amalgamated folklore monster that harvests human organs and body parts to keep itself alive. And it's also played by Doc Brown from Back to the Future. Go figure. Now, I'm no tree monster specialist, so the best I can think of is a Wendigo meets a Leshen from The Witcher, but a significant element that might be a deterrent for some is how vague the film chooses to be. You're going to get little in the way of answers besides a bittersweet revelation at the end, as O'Brien further told Film in Revolt that he chose to omit the first-person perspective of the novel, so that instead of a narration of what's going on in John's head, we're left to perpetually speculate on everything that happens. For the most part, it seems John is trying to ultimately stop the killer, but to me it feels he spends more of his time largely observing Bill, and then poking and prodding him out of curiosity to see what will happen, whilst building a profile to understand Bill and his MO. From John's perspective, it's clear that Bill targets people with limbs and organs that are in better condition than his own. In particular, he sees Bill out one night dancing with his wife Kay, and when his knees give out, causing him to sulk at the bar while another man takes over dancing with Kay, he sees Bill then target him the next day almost out of jealousy, let alone having better hips and knees than him. You don't really get to know too much about Bill, but since John helps him and Kay around their house given their frail condition, there's an increasingly tragic element where Bill's murders are essentially his only means of surviving. It's obviously not a means of justifying it, but Christopher Lloyd does a subtly impressive job at making you sympathize with his aging and how disconnected he's slowly becoming from the world, much like John, if for different reasons. While John struggles to meaningfully involve himself due to his sociopathy, Bill struggles to involve himself because his body is beginning to feel. The suggestion here is that John might actually come to empathize with Bill's internal loneliness. Maybe a sociopath can understand this psychopath. Perhaps there's an ethereal connection that they both share. As the town grows hysterical over the increasing string of murders, particularly after Bill kills 2 police officers when John intervenes during a murder, it begins to much more directly call attention to what O'Brien told Dead Central was the film's common theme. We have a boy who loves hunting the monsters, and a man who is killing for love. To best convey this, there's a point in the story where Kay talks to John's mother about Bill going through depression and is perhaps afraid of winter given his ailing condition. She encourages John to go visit Bill since they have a good relationship, where Bill tells him about 2 poems by William Blake called The Lamb and the Tiger. As Bill explains, one was born from sweetness and love, while the other was forged from terror and death. But the question the poet asks is how both these things came from the same creator. That is, how can God create both good and bad creatures and place them in the same plane of existence? If you want to dig into the existentialism of it, it poses John and Bill as the lamb and tiger respectively. Or at least it seems that way until you consider the interior and exterior of their characters. John is never outwardly a terror to the world. He's actually a fairly innocent kid whose darkness seems to be buried deep within, whereas Bill is outwardly terrorizing the town and killing people, yet there's a love and tenderness conveyed in every interaction he has with John and Kay, who are effectively the only 2 people in his life. It brings together O'Brien's point when, after John's constant efforts to track and harass Bill leads him to finding Bill kill his friend's father, causing John to show genuine anger despite claiming he doesn't care due to his sociopathy. Calling back to my earlier point about why John doesn't get into a relationship with a potential love interest, it shows that for all John's fears of being the monster and his insistence that he has no empathy, he does care about people, or at the very least understands right from wrong. After acknowledging the pain this has caused to John's friend and realizing the essence of having a meaningful connection, John surpasses his tipping point when he attempts to threaten Bill out of town by terrorizing Kay, only to accidentally hit her with a clock and believe he killed her. Thankfully, however, Kay survives, but John soon discovers Bill's next motive is to acquire a new heart, and it just so happens that his victim is John's therapist Grant. Realizing that death is Bill's only true fear, he moves the body in an effort to confront Bill once and for all, which leads Bill to abducting his mother and taking her to the mortuary after John's friend's dad's funeral. Again, sociopathic diagnosis aside, John is showing some form of understanding of what the people around him truly mean to him. He fears for his mother's safety, he fears sadness for his friend. All the emotions his self-fulfilling prophecy led him to believe don't exist are starting to pour out. It's at this point the story reveals that it's ultimately about love. John soon subdues Bill and embalms him, causing the monster to escape its vessel and reveal its true form. But rather than continue to fight for its self-preservation, it accepts it's finally time and asks John to look after Kay before willingly finishing the embalming process and dying. The film ends with John checking in on a grieving Kay, who says Bill had an infectious lust for life, and when he met Kay for the first time, he finally discovered what true love was. It was the first experience to ever truly make him feel something real and profound. Bill killed out of love. His motive was to always be there for Kay. He killed so that he would never leave her alone. It was less so for himself, and always for her. Of course, the film doesn't resolve John's issues, so to speak, it's never that easy, but the spark of humour he shows back at the mortuary at least suggests he can take it one day at a time, and perhaps develop enough self-compassion to realise he's not really that bad a guy.